Okay, well, we'll make a start. Thanks for joining us. My name's Marcus Ransom. I'm a technical delivery manager here at CompNow. So we're going to go through some of the announced changes Apple have made to their deployment program, as well as looking at some of the features of the new systems and some of the benefits that you'll get when you migrate to them. Okay, so you may be aware that Apple's announced that the legacy deployment portals, deploy.apple.com and the volume purchasing program App Store, will not be available as of December 1. So if you're currently using these portals, you'll need to migrate to the new Apple Business Manager or School Manager, including apps and books, by this date to ensure functionality. So today we're going to be going through the process of migrating from the legacy programs through to the new programs and some of the tips and tricks along the way. If you've already completed that migration in your organization, this first part of this webinar will be covering ground you've already been over. You might want to wait around to the second part where we're going through some of the features of the new program. Okay, so the legacy deploy.apple.com accounts, formerly known as DEP, to migrate, you log in as the program agent user, which was used for the initial setup. So this may not be the account that you've been using for day-to-day use. It's an admin account for this program. Fairly simple prompts to follow to migrate that system, and that will bring all of your devices, all of your MDM settings, everything across to the new Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager. If you aren't currently using DEP or Automated Device Enrolment, as Apple now call it, even if you are using volume purchasing, you will need to enroll in Apple School Manager or Apple Business Manager prior to December 1 to be able to continue deploying applications using VPP. So enrollment requires a DUNS number for business, and both schools and business require a verification contact to confirm your organizational details, agreeing to the terms and conditions. So this is the enrollment step where we see a few delays with organizations. Apple will not call back a second time after leaving a message. So it's important to make a time with whoever that verification contact is in your organization, if it's not you, and arrange to call Apple back on the number that they give you. So Apple's support documentation goes through the process of enrolment, and we'll be sending out a bunch of links at the end of this webinar to all the attendees with that information on there. So once you've set up Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager, if you have multiple VPP accounts, you'll need to invite them in to into your new deployment portal. So there's several scenarios where you may need to do that. Where you have multiple VPP accounts, if you set up volume purchasing pre-2014, they're what's known as legacy accounts, or if you're using volume purchasing without using Automated Device Enrolment or DEP. So the process for inviting those accounts, you go into the enrollment settings in the Apple School, Apple Business Manager portal, and down in the bottom right of the settings with enrollment information, you see the Invite VPP Program Facilitator. It prompts you to put in the email address or Apple ID being used by that account. They get an email inviting them into the portal and converting it to a managed Apple ID. Now, there is one very important step when inviting in those legacy VPP accounts. Now, that is that they must be invited into a unique location. So Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager have the concept of locations, different organizational units within the portal. When the VPP account logs into Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager, and enables apps and books, they're going to be prompted to choose a location. So you need to pre-configure those locations and then ensure that they select the location that you've picked for them. If they don't pick their own unique location, only unused apps licenses will migrate. and they'll get a prompt that they're migrating into an already used location, which can sometimes be missed if they're not careful. So this is the important step. If migrated properly, so each VPP account and all of its apps gets migrated into its own pristine, unique location, all app and book licenses, both in use and unused, get transferred across, including the S token. So no action is then required in your MDM. It just continues to work as it was before. Check with your MDM provider that they do support location-based tokens, which have been in use for a couple of years. All the major MDMs support this. Some of the less well-known, less up-to-date MDMs may not support this, but all of the commonly known MDMs support this. So any questions and issues with migrating, enrolling, or inviting, Apple have a dedicated deployment portal support number, 1300-664-285. This is the best place to go for any issues that you encounter. For privacy reasons, it needs to be the owner of the account, the administrator of the account that is contacting. They will verify that you are in fact from the organization requesting support. It's not something that you can subcontract out to a third party. Really, really good dedicated support. This is not the number that you call where you've got, warranty issues with your phone, those sorts of things. These are trained staff that understand the migration process. I've used them myself a couple of times to find out information about some of our own migrations here, to assist customers. Really, really good support. So let's go on to some of the new features. So as well as, so Apple have got the deadline of December 1, where you will no longer be able to use the legacy deploy.apple.com and volume purchasing program. So after that deadline, our understanding is if you try to log into those portals, you will only be given the option to upgrade. And so you won't be able to perform any migrations or changes until after you have migrated. So we're definitely encouraging everybody to get their migrations done before December 1, so you don't end up in a scenario where you're not able to administer your program. So the benefits of the new systems, why are Apple moving to the new systems? It's a lot more modern, a lot more flexible, significantly more features than the old program. So one of the frustrations around the legacy systems, the common practice of having one organizational Apple ID that was used for logging in. So it usually ended up with multiple numbers on two-factor authentication. And rather than increasing security, that often led to reduced security with shared passwords, not really knowing who was accessing it. So migrating to Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager, allows us to take a much more considered approach to access. So each user of the portal should have their own individual login. This has many benefits aside from security, of not needing to share or document passwords and the associated risks. You can have individual two-factor authentication that can be reset. It allows you to grant and revoke access to individual accounts. If somebody leaves your organization, you can suspend or remove their individual account without needing to think about who else was using that account and knew the password or changing the password. So in addition to the individual logins, each managed Apple ID can be allocated a role that gives the level of access that's required for that user. So people are only granted access to the things that they require to be able to perform their job. So in Apple Business Manager, we can see that the roles are primarily for administering the portal with different access based on what you're responsible for. So we can see the red and orange roles there for the overall administrator, and then people manager for managing roles, device manager for managing automated device enrollment, and content manager for managing apps and books. The administrator role is also prompted to ensure that there are more than one administrator. Now, this is to avoid scenarios where you lose access to high-level functionality. So the system does encourage you to have more than one and up to 5 administrators, which is good practice for this kind of a system. So Apple School Manager has additional roles: student and instructor, which integrate with Apple Classroom, Classwork, Shared iPad, as well as offering users iCloud on device. So we see that, once again, the red and orange used for administering the portal, and then the purple, green, and blue, which are used on device. So we can also see what the different permissions are for each of the roles, and assign them appropriately, granularly, or also customize them if required. So essentially there are two kinds of managed Apple IDs, those for interacting with the portal and those for being used on device. So once we got the ability to manage and have ownership of Apple IDs as an organization, federation was the next big thing. So Apple School Managers had the ability to federate with Azure AD, and just over a week ago, this came to Apple Business Manager. So the process for federating is quite straightforward. You sign into your portal, in settings, you authenticate to Azure AD with an account that has the appropriate admin rights in Azure, global administrator, application administrator, or cloud application administrator. And then you select the domain that you're wanting to federate. Now, you'll be notified how many personal Apple IDs already exist using that domain as their username and password. So it does that conflict check to see, most organizations will already have people using that domain for a personal Apple ID. Now, one quick note, this requires Azure AD. It's not on-prem Active Directory. So you can synchronize your on-prem Active Directory up to Azure, which a lot of organizations are doing now. This is something CompNow can assist you with if you need some help with that. So existing managed Apple IDs you may have created manually in Apple Business Manager, Apple School Manager, can be set to use federated authentication if you configure the details to match the federated username. So let's look at the process for resolving those conflicting personal Apple IDs, and most importantly, the timelines associated with that. Now, it's important to note that you are not adopting those existing Apple IDs into Apple School Manager. The personal Apple ID remains as is with all its purchases and data intact. The user of that just gets prompted to create a new username or email from a different domain for their Apple ID, so that there's no risk of federation issues. So there may still be, and probably are, many Apple IDs out there using your domain for users and email addresses that were decommissioned a long time ago. Their email no longer functions because they left your organization a long time ago. They may or may not be actively used. So if they're using the Apple ID, even if they don't have access to the email, to get the email notification that they've got 60 days, they'll get notified on the device that they're using that they need to change the username. So they'll get those by both email and device notifications. Those notifications will continue at an increasing frequency as you get closer to the 60 days. If they ignore those notifications, or if it's in fact not being used, it'll just automatically be migrated to a new iCloud username after 60 days. So their password doesn't change, they just get given a new username. And then that original email address is then released to your organization. So if you go through that federation process, any non-conflicting usernames are available to use for managed Apple IDs immediately. Any that have a conflict will get a notification to resolve the conflict, and as that conflict is resolved, either by the person using that as their personal Apple ID moving to a different email address, or the 60-day deadline finishing, they will then be able to federate that Apple ID. So it's important also to know that not all personal Apple IDs are in fact used for personal content. You may have several Apple IDs that should be treated with care while you're federating. Apple IDs you're using for your MDM push certificate, GSX access, organizations that that are part of the GSX, either for warranty lookup, that's Apple's global service exchange, or their service providers doing repairs. They'll need to work carefully with Apple Care to understand the impact of that. There may also be personal Apple IDs that we use to purchase organizational content directly from the Apple Store, not through VPP. whilst it may have been the organisation that paid for that content, that Apple ID is still considered to be a personal Apple ID. So what we've seen organisations do to, because these Apple IDs will, as long as they use the domain you federated, are going to be prompted to migrate. So that's where we see people using email subdomains for those email addresses. So they can still retain control and access to these what were once known as institutional Apple IDs without that impacting on the federation. So once the federation is complete, managed Apple ID can sign into iCloud on their devices and authenticate via the familiar Azure AD Federation screen. We've also got the new user enrolment that came with iOS 13 and Catalina, which allows a more modern approach to BYD enrolment. We are using that managed Apple ID, either a staff or a student one, to associate that personally owned device with your MDM. So now that we've got federation in Apple School Manager and Apple Business Manager, we should federate all of our Apple IDs, right? Well, maybe it's not as straightforward as that. So we should make a careful consideration before deciding that we're going to use managed Apple IDs as the primary Apple ID on our fleet. So I've found that it's easier to make this decision based on what features are not available for managed Apple IDs compared to a personal Apple ID. So for younger students, you can see that the feature set is designed for them to only have access to what they need. This may not be the case for staff members. You may be forcing inefficiencies onto staff who regularly use some of these features for collaboration or coordinating work-life balances. So the big one is no commerce. So managed Apple IDs do not have access to the App Store to be able to purchase individual apps free or paid. They're designed for MDM assigned content only. So in schools, for example, teachers will need to use a personal Apple ID if they want to test out an app without involving the IT department, or if they go to a seminar where there's an app that's used for that. So no HomeKit. So you can't use a managed Apple ID for any of the automation with HomeKit. No Find My iPhone, Find My Mac, Find My Friends. There's no iCloud mail because it's expected that you will have your own organization email. No iCloud keychains. So no efficiencies with securely sharing credentials between devices. FaceTime and iMessage are disabled by default, but that can be turned on. And a managed Apple ID also remains with an organization. So when somebody leaves that organization, any content that they've got stored in iCloud stays with that managed Apple ID. It's not able to be converted to a personal Apple ID when a student graduates or a staff member leaves. Now, it's also important to know that there isn't currently a way you can lock devices down to only use a managed Apple ID. The MDM spec at the moment allows you to prevent someone signing in to iCloud, but at this stage, there's no way to differentiate between a personal Apple ID or a managed Apple ID. So another great feature of managed Apple IDs is Apple Seed for IT. So this used to be by invitation only. You had to have a fairly large number of devices and a really good relationship with your Apple SE. So Apple Seed for IT is focused on IT department testing, whereas the Apple Developer Program and their betas are focused around issues developing software for new OS versions. Apple Seed for IT is specifically for testing integration within your organization. Things like 802.1x Wi-Fi, MDM integration, Active Directory security tools. So you can use any of the managed Apple IDs except student managed Apple IDs for logging into Apple Seed for IT. And that gives your IT staff the ability to download beta versions of software for testing and providing feedback for Apple about any issues that you come across. And this is where it's really useful, because any feedback you lodge through the developer program is going to go to engineers that are focused on developing apps to use within that operating system and how it works in that ecosystem. Whereas using a managed Apple ID that's part of Apple Seed for IT, any of your feedback radar cases will be forwarded to internal teams that are equipped to investigate issues specifically relating to that IT integration. So we've had fantastic results working within Appleseed for IT with the latest crop of betas. Some issues that we came across got resolved very quickly and were in fact resolved before we got the public releases of Catalina and iOS 13. Now, this also reminds us that beta testing shouldn't just happen around what Apple release at Worldwide Developer Conference. It should be happening all year round. All of the point releases go through pre-releases through Appleseed for IT, so you can get prior warning of what sort of features Apple is going to be releasing into your environment, and be prepared to be able to offer that immediately, resolve any issues for your users. So your beta testing shouldn't be happening on production devices because we should be expecting there to be some issues that need to be ironed out. But it is important to be testing all year round in your production environment on those test devices, so you can raise issues to the surface before your users want to upgrade. Testing it on a machine at home isn't going to give you that integration with your security tools, your Wi-Fi, everything like that. So all of the good MDM providers offer beta versions as well that can be used to test the new functionality, especially when it's matching the new operating system functionality. So let's talk about managing devices and how we can get some functionality out of Apple School Manager and Apple Business Manager in this sort of area. So one of the main benefits of the new portal when it comes to device management is being able to set separate default MDM servers by device type. So this is great for organizations that may use one MDM for managing their phones or another one for their iPads or Macs. We can even get as granular as setting separate defaults for Apple TVs and iPod Touches if you're managing these. So default MDM servers are great when you purchase devices and you want to see them appear in the correct MDM server as soon as the vendor has assigned them to you. The phones, when they're added, will automatically go to whatever your MDM server is that is allocated as the default for phones, same for Macs, iPods, Apple TV, iPad. Setting a default enrollment pre-stage within your MDM also streamlines this. But what do we do when we need to move a group of devices in the same MDM from one pre-stage to another without having to search and manually select serial numbers, which can be pretty time consuming, and the chances of making mistakes or missing a device are fairly high. So one trick I've used is the ability to create a CSV of all of the serial numbers I need to move around. Ensure the pre-stage I want them to be moved into is selected as the default assignment within the MDM, and then go into Apple Business Manager and manage MDM assignments on multiple serials at once using the CSV upload. This is also available in School Manager. If the devices are already assigned to that MDM server, reassign them to none. Don't release the devices, but just reassign them to no MDM server. Wait for the device records to sync, which is 5 minutes if you're using Jamf, and then reassign them back. When they're reassigned back to your MDM, it does the API checkup. It will then move them into whatever is the default pre-stage within your MDM. And so that's a really good way of getting, schools, for example, may use a different pre-stage for different year levels for devices. The end of year refresh of devices can often result in a lot of devices getting moved around. And this is a way I've found to really streamline this. So migrating VPP accounts into Apple Business, Apple School Manager has been the last piece of the puzzle for these portals. As we've discussed, there's plenty of scenarios where you have more than one MDM to work with. So the S tokens that are used to configure your VPP account, now apps and books in your MDM, can only be used with one MDM server at a time, or rather I will say should only be used with one MDM server at a time. If you try and have that S token in multiple MDM servers, that's where you can see issues with licenses. So this can make things quite challenging if you're trying to test app deployments on a beta MDM, or moving from one MDM to another, or just managing devices across multiple MDMs. So as we discussed when we were talking about inviting those accounts, we've now got the concept of locations. And so you can use locations to define different business units, physical campuses, or just different management servers. So each location has its own individual S token that you would then install in your MDM. And you can assign roles to only have access to certain locations. So users are only able to interact with the content that they've actually got permission for. So as well as being able to purchase content into a specific location, for example, here we're going to purchase some of the iOS app of Keynote. When we go to purchase it, we choose a location that gets allocated to its corresponding S token. You can actually transfer unused licenses. So any licenses of Keynote, so we can see that are not currently being deployed to users, we can actually move those around. It's great if you're migrating from one MDM to another where you've got some paid content that you don't want to have to purchase too many more than you really need. So you can also purchase credit to be used in apps and books through CompNow. We supply you with a redemption code that you enter into settings that can then be used by those that have the content manager role that allows them to purchase content. That means you don't have to worry about setting up credit cards and dealing with credit limits. And that really doesn't suit a lot of organizations. The other great feature of apps and books in Apple School Manager and Apple Business Manager, anybody familiar with using the VPP store, every single app that you purchased, for example, at the start of the school year where you've got a new app list, you had to authenticate for each app multiple times. Because of the new modern authentication methods for Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager, once it's confident that it knows who you are, it can let you just go and run through the list and purchase all of the apps without having to authenticate multiple times. So I've found it to be a lot more efficient, a lot more flexible. This is why Apple is getting us to jump through a bunch of hoops to migrate across to this new system, because of the features that it brings. So now that we've got all the pieces in place for our deployment and we've moved across to Apple Business Manager, Apple School Manager, and we're using a really good MDM solution, CompNow can also help you streamline the onboarding process. So we all know that imaging is dead and we can no longer net boot new Apple machines. And we also know that we shouldn't be trying to clone a fully configured machine setup onto another machine. That due to a lot of the security improvements that Apple's brought into Mac OS, this is not something that's supported by Apple. So I'm going to show you a setup that we're using that can streamline the process of automated device enrollment, where users are handed fresh machines and then they turn them on and they're automatically enrolled in your MDM over the air on first boot. So the following video has been sped up for this demo, but at actual speed, the user is able to turn on their device, connect to the Wi-Fi, and have it fully configured in under 5 minutes. And that includes logging out to initiate file vault encryption. So CompNow is able to leverage tools within the operating system. So Apple provided binaries to wipe and reinstall the latest version of Mac OS onto a machine before it goes out to site, as well as pre-install packages. So this allows devices to be shipped to the user for them to go through the automated device enrollment process and anything you then configure with your MDM that we see here with the latest version of Mac OS, and eliminate the time and bandwidth required for software to be installed after enrollment. This also allows it to scale. We see a lot of schools where they're trying to deploy a whole class of Macs at once, and if they're trying to install 5, 10, 20 gig of software onto those machines, that can lead to issues with bandwidth, whether it's through their Wi-Fi, their network, their distribution point, even their WAN, and may lead to errors with the device enrollment and failures. It's also a much better user experience if they're then not hit with a 45-minute update and multiple reboots. Once again, there's also fewer chances for issues and things to go wrong. So if you're interested in finding out about what we can help you with this process, speak to us afterwards, speak to your business development manager, and we can fill you in with all of the details. Now, we've got a little bit of time left, so we might see if there's some questions we've got that can that may be able to help some of the people on the webinar here. So we've got the first question here from Elliot Smith saying, "Hi there, do you know what the login experience is like if Azure Active Directory is federated with a different single sign-on?" So you're still using the Azure Active Directory, if I understand this question correctly, you will just be getting that Azure. So if you have got it configured with other sign-ons, I haven't seen anywhere where that changes that federation logon experience. I've only come across where they are having that Azure federation. Because it is literally just pointing you to Azure, whatever your experience is going to be with other systems, I would expect would be consistent. Apple is just pointing you to Azure and whatever is configured there for that login. And then when it gets that success back, it then allows you to proceed. Okay, so that looks like that's all the questions that we have at this stage. Hopefully that that answered that question there. We'll send out a link to everyone that's that joined in the webinar with the Apple documentation, the contact number for Apple Care, Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager support. And any questions at all that you've got after this, just reach out to your business development manager, and we'll help you assist any of the issues. Now, it's important to know, we'll just reiterate again, the deadline from Apple is December 1. So I would recommend initiating your migration as soon as possible, rather than being in a position after December 1 where you're having to do that as soon as you log in, rather than being able to plan and coordinate that migration. So thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. It can be a very busy time of the year. I look forward to speaking to you all soon.